Welcome novices and acolytes to the Sisterhood, presented by DuneNewsNet.com and What the Force. Join us on this meta-mythic journey through the Dune universe.
Welcome novices to the Sisterhood Podcast. I'm Hannah, your host, and with me is MC from What the Force. Hello, everyone. Welcome to your meta-mythical feast. If you want to follow us for future episodes, you can find us at Podcast Above All on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Instagram. Twitter and Blue Sky at Shihaya Spring. And where can people find you, MC? I am mostly known for my Star Wars podcast, which is What the Force, which WT Force Show on Twitter or WT Force on Blue Sky. You can also find me personally as Marie C. Gould, pretty much on all socials. I mean, I also want to say, like and subscribe to this video because then you'll catch up with all of the cool Dune people that are talking all about this on Dune Newsnet. This show covers Dune prophecy from a meta-mythic perspective. And if you're new to this sort of format, like you haven't listened to one of my shows before, or you haven't explored media from this particular lens, it might be quite new to you. So we wanted to talk all about what is a mythic analysis of a piece of media. So primarily I do it from Star Wars perspective, which means that I use the lens of Joseph Campbell, who primarily talked about the hero's journey, the monomyth, as a lens by which to talk about story. But actually, what we find is that when you add other people who talk about these things all together, it gives you a better and deeper understanding of the mythic motifs, psychological resonance that we find in our media. So when a story is particularly plugged into the symbolism that we experience as humans, we find it very satisfying. It helps us to dig deeper into the show or movie or story and find deeper meaning for ourselves. Really, when you're watching a piece of fiction, it's actually on display not only in front of you, but also sort of mirroring things that are happening on the inside. And so when you're particularly into something that's happening on screen or you react strongly to something, there's a meaning behind that. And we can see that in the interpretation of both the mythic motifs, the symbolism and themes that are presented on screen. And so our intention is to talk about Dune prophecy with that lens and give you a little bit of a deeper dive than maybe you would get anywhere else. Let's start with some general overall thoughts on the episode. I really, really enjoyed this episode. Thankfully, we were able to get screeners. It gave us some extra time to sit with it because there was a lot that was going on. And I think one of the biggest things that really stood out to me, which I was really glad was at the forefront, was how much this episode focused on the female stories that were taking place within the sisterhood, but even outside of the sisterhood. That was the perspective that I wanted the show to take ever since it was announced, because this is kind of a peek behind the veil, and the sets were gorgeous. The scale was amazing. You could feel the depth in all of the scenes. There was this one moment where I think it was when Desmond was talking to the Emperor, and you could see the fountain in the background, and the water was it was functioning, and the water was dripping out of it. It felt massive, and I was happy to see that because it feels like it's a part of Dune in that way. Yeah, absolutely. For myself, I was enthralled by this opening episode. I think that there was some interesting sort of choices that maybe could have been delivered in a stronger way. The voiceover, I don't know that landed with everybody on the internet, but I think that it's such a hard lift for them to get into where they are in the universe that, hey, the voiceover always worked on the extended edition of the Dune movie from the 80s. For me, like when they did the robot wars, because I never understood that before I read the novel, right? I think that the voiceover did a lot of heavy lifting and it was okay.
Mhm.
I can see
Yeah.
how it landed like quite, tell me, don't show me. And that's okay. They had to get us in there. I totally don't expect
Mm.
the voiceover to be as strong in future episodes.
Maybe. I don't I'm almost feeling like maybe we won't get another
Yeah.
narration at all, and it'll just, like, this is what you needed to know going in, and now we're just gonna you'll be able to know what's happening when it flashes to the past because 'cause you'll see the people and you'll know what's happening.
Yeah.
Like, I
Yeah.
don't think they'll need to introduce that,
Or
and
they
I
might
also feel like
for flashbacks. I'm not sure.
possibly, but another thing that I'm thinking is potentially the way that some people feel about the intro now might change later on because I think a really strong theme in the show will be what is truth, what is history, what is prophecy, and what does that really mean? And how reliable is this narrator actually? You
Yeah, it's an
know? So,
unreliable narrator, right? Like, absolutely. And that's what I've found is audiences sometimes struggle with unreliable narrators. We're supposed to trust the
mm,
narrator. Absolutely. But again, she could be lying to herself too.
mhm,
Um, no, that's a great point. I love it. Also, history is built in the eyes of the victors. She even talks about
mm,
how it was based on a lie. And what we're finding is prophecy and the outcomes of that is also based in the victories of those that take it on. And I think we'll talk a little bit about
mhm,
that before we get into the episode proper. But no, I'm loving
definitely.
it. I love the symbolic mythic motifs, even down to the costuming and the choices that they
Mm,
make. It all ties into the story that they're trying to tell, and they're using the sound design, the sets, they're using the costuming, they're
mhm.
using the symbolism and themes to all tell the same story, which means it's entirely my jam, and I'm so happy to be here for it.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that really stood out to me just as a general note would be, it feels like the time period that it's set in. Like, you can tell that it's been only very recently that we've gotten rid of thinking machines,
Mhm.
and you can tell that it's still such a long way from how archaic that world feels like, how traditional and how separate it is from technology. So it
Well,
really feels like it
even the
captures its
choice
time
to not
period.
use Bene
Mm,
Gesserit actively as a title for the
mhm.
sisterhood, just the
Exactly.
sisterhood, like, we have to remember, like, it's 2024. Um,
Mm,
it's been only 2,000 years since the Roman Empire, even less.
mhm,
And this is 10,000 years different. So it's gonna be different, and even just the fact that it feels very strict and very
mm,
early is great because then it's morphing over time too.
mhm, exactly. And so we'll jump into questions and comments. If anyone has a comment on this episode that they'd love to leave, you can do so in the YouTube comments. You can also reach us on any of our social media, and we'll start with one for today's episode.
We love questions and we want to read them and engage with you because I think that especially as you're digging into the themes and the things that you're seeing and the symbolism and what it all means, it can be quite overwhelming as you start to see it. So engage, reach out to us, comment on YouTube, reach out to us socials, and we'll try to include as many as we can. So Chome Director on Blue Sky was actually the only one who managed to get an answer to my out there saying, "Hey, do you have any questions?" They said the lots of chatter around Arafel and the Emperor, God Emperor of Dune references, and
Mhm.
I have sort of nerd thoughts, but what are your thoughts, Hannah?
It's very interesting, that they chose Turan Arafel to talk about this sort of catastrophic moment in the future, because I think one for fans of Dune who maybe they've, only really read the first book, a term that would be more familiar would be, um, Krelizek, which is the battle at the end of time, and that's this, like, battle that Paul sees in his visions in the book where he's like, I need to avoid that at all costs.
Or
Um,
the
and
jihad, which I can see why they would
mm,
avoid that name, right? This is a different way
Yeah.
to say.
And I think that what's interesting too is that they choose Arafel. It's in God Emperor of Dune in that novel, and he talks about it in the context of the Ixians and the stuff that they've been doing. They're no longer creating Arafel. It's a Hebrew term which means mist or fog. And Tiran Arafel essentially means God brings this mist of doom.
Hmm.
Um, and so I think it's interesting because what sets this apart is Arafel seems like a smaller version of what Krelizak is, where Krelizak is like just the absolute ending of everything. Whereas Arafel seems like the function of the things that people do within the Imperium and the effects that they have on everybody else. And in the context of the Sisterhood, it's this doom that will be brought on by a tyrant ruler over the Imperium, um, which is also interesting considering that this show is framed as being like 10,000 years before the birth of Paul Atreides.
Yeah.
It is like a frame of reference for people with the movies, but it's also very interesting that we open with the thing that they're worried about is a
So far away.
tyrannical emperor. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And it's so far away too. Like I feel like there's a lot of themes of existentialism. I can't really
Mhm.
like talk about it too much until we get a little bit more, but the idea that like there's this inevitability to what they're trying to do. And, that ties into prophecy and who gets to make the decision of what ends up being in there. And existentialism is really like the perfect lens by which to view this show so far because it also involves free will. But for who,
Mhm.
right? So it's interesting. So one of the things that we're going to be talking about the show from a lens of is life archetypes. And life archetypes, they've been around for a really long time because people naturally go through different phases of life. And those have been captured by writers from an archetypical perspective in how they show up in our stories across time. So Joseph Campbell originally talks about them in A Hero with a Thousand Faces. He uses slightly different words than the ones that we're going to be using because we prefer K.M. Whalen's particular interpretation of these, where she's pulled together a bunch of different sources to use this as a particular lens. And so we're going to be using this framework just because we find it quite useful to talk about mythic motifs with this lens. These are change archetypes. So there are flat archetypes out there. Um, Pruitt is our child. He's a flat archetype. We'll have a flat archetype we're going to talk about in a second. But flat archetypes they aren't changing. They're kind of stable where they are, and they usually function as a archetype for other people. They're often kind of sit within the archetype for a long period of time and aren't really changing. The life archetypes are broken into three phases. The first phase is early on in life. The positive archetypes, positive change archetypes, I'm going in a positive direction. I'm improving myself. I'm transforming and becoming a better person. Are maiden and hero. There are negative archetypes that are on either side of those, which means that you're not changing in a positive archetype way. Sometimes they're called shadow archetypes. It means that you're sort of stubbornly hanging on to the phase that you're in. And you might just advance because age or situation means that you've grown up or had to take on more responsibility, but you're still sitting in a shadow archetype phase. And so those are on the aggressive side, vixen and bully, and on the passive side, damsel and coward. As we get into the second phase of life, we have queen and king, and we have the sort of aggressive negative archetypes of sorceress and tyrant. And then the passive ones are snow queen, like Elsa, and puppet. And then finally, we get into sort of the third phase of life. This is our sort of retirement community or later middle age uh, archetypes. And again, these are not gendered, I should also say. And I'll get into that in a second, but nor are they necessarily age required. It's actually about the things that you've gone through and the wisdom that you have rather than necessarily your age. But typically,
Mhm.
a younger character in fiction will fall into the first phase, a middle-aged character, or like I'm starting a family will fall into the middle phase, and then the last phase, crone, mage, which we of course have our negative archetypes of wicked witch and sorcerer versus the passive hermit. I'm hiding away from the world, or the miser. I often use Lord of the Rings as a good explanation for these because you have the different characters actually all throughout all these different phases. This is important. It's a really good framework to use because we can track characters' journeys through whether they're flat, moving positively, ending up in a shadow archetype or a negative archetype for a while. And it helps us see what they need to do to progress to either go from a negative archetype into a positive change archetype or progress from a maiden to be a hero, being that a maiden is constrained by the situation, society, parents they're around versus a hero going off on their adventure. The most famous archetypical exploration, of course, being a hero with 1,000 pieces that Joseph Campbell released. There are other words for some of the feminine archetypes: maiden, mother, crone, which, or goddess. We've heard all of those before as well. So some of these will sound familiar. Um, and they will also help us to kind of talk about the characters from a psychological lens in a little bit more detail in what they're going through and what is happening within the show as well.
So the first character that we're going to discuss for archetypes is Valya Harkonnen. And she fits into the sorceress queen sort of realm.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like she's sitting at sorceress, but she can move into being a queen,
Yes.
potentially.
Yeah. And I also think she might try to move into being a king because of, the
Mm.
king represents the queen herself is somebody who cares about the family. So you've gone out, you've had your adventures, you've fought your dragons as a hero, and you've moved into creating a family, right? And so
Mhm.
Valia is very focused on creating the sisterhood and the family that she needs to create. And so she's very focused on creating the perfect ruler. Um,
Mhm.
and she's aggressive about it. She doesn't necessarily
Mhm.
do it in a positive way. Like even Tula points out, like, you just want followers. They call her out in the fact that she is so aggressive in her
Mhm.
actions. But I do think that the challenges that she is facing will put her into a situation where she must make more positive queen like choices to protect her family and move into the king archetype, which is when the queen finally decides that actually the kingdom is under attack, they have to step into a leadership role to protect the kingdom. That's how you change
Yeah,
from
and I
being a
think
queen to a king.
what's a really good example here would be that um her position in the sorceress is kind of, for now anyway, is kind of an example of she's a vixen when she's younger, and her
Mhm.
transition into maturity is what moves her from vixen to sorceress.
Yeah.
Because
And
she's the
she was
same.
probably a bully for a while too, right? And we'll probably
Mm,
see that in some of the flashbacks.
yeah, it's kind of that
Very
aggressive
aggressive.
negative archetype, just like continuing.
But she
Yeah,
has the
and that's
opportunity to
kind
be
of.
more balanced and potentially do
Mhm,
something to benefit the overall universe itself as
yeah.
a king. Making the sacrifices that you have to make
Mhm.
to protect everyone.
Yeah, and Tula, she's definitely right now a queen, because her
With
mindset and
balance.
focus is.
Yeah.
Yes, she believes in this goal of the sisterhood, but she's more focused on, let's take it a step at a time, make sure we're doing it the right way, and she wants to take care of the girls and train them, and that's where her focus is,
It's very, like,
and she's.
internalized, motherly, like,
Yeah.
that sort of focus, and it's actually, like, that internal focus journey on, in these phases, again, they're not gendered, but the maiden is about internalizing and, um, integrating darkness, and the
Mhm.
when you get into sort of the masculine named phases, it's about fighting the darkness on the outside. So it's like internalized journey versus external journey. Like the hero goes and fights the dragons, the queen goes and tries to solve the problems with the family or with the internal kingdom. The king is fighting the threat, the existential threat to the
Mm-hmm.
universe. The crone is very focused on mentoring the next generation, and the mage cares about the overall galaxy and beyond. Um, it's internalized, externalized, internalized, externalized. It's the ebbs and flows of how we flow through life. And
Mm-hmm.
Tula right now is very focused on the kids.
Yeah, very much so. And then we have Kasha, who is sitting as a king in her position
Yeah.
because of her closeness to the emperor, and where she is, she's really the one who's pulling the strings. She's advising Havako in a way where it's essentially her who's ruling.
Yeah. And she is making the decisions by which it protects the kingdom at large, because the life phases are about becoming the next phase. Kings themselves have to deal with the threat to the overall kingdom and the inevitability of them having to sacrifice themselves for the continuation of the kingdom. We see that in this episode, in that Kasha, she dies to deliver the message to Valya and to the sisterhood that interpreted everything correctly.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And kind of a good segue with Kasha is she has a very close relationship with Ynez, and she's kind of brought her up since childhood. And Ynez is sort of the sisterhood's putting all of their hope into her and the role that she's going to play. But right now, she's still in her maiden phase. But what's interesting is that she has a lot of ambition, but she's still, I think, very much a damsel,
Mhm.
which is pretty interesting. And Kasha specifically mentions that when the sisterhood found her, she was imprisoned. And I think
The
it
language
it's
around it was very specific.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's very much princess in a tower kind of
Mhm.
idea. And I think MC mentioned that could she possibly be adopted? So I'm curious if there's going to be more about that specifically. But at least for now, it definitely feels more like a kept in a tower by her family, the parental figures around her
Mhm.
is kind of where she's at.
It actually doesn't matter archetypically if, she was found or not. She has been, from a phase perspective, she was previously very passive in her choices, and she's making more solid choices to escape her parental figures and the constraints of the obligations of what is around her, right? So she's making her own choices, as bad as they might be. I would say that she might fluctuate to Vixen a little bit in this episode,
Mm,
obviously. Vixen being, what we typically associate with a femme fatale, but again, not
mhm,
gendered. It has to do with being aggressive in the maiden phase, where you have a mentor or parental figure on top of you. And that's what defines the maiden phase in general, is that you're kind of under the thumb of somebody else.
mhm.
And so it'll be interesting to see what plays out with all of the fallout from this episode in the next couple of episodes. And I'm really excited to talk more in depth about people's journeys and these arcs.
For Kieran, what's interesting about him is I think we'll see more from him in terms of an archetype in the future,
Mhm.
but as he stands in this episode itself, he's the lover, which is more of a kind of flat archetype.
Yeah, it's the
But in
flat
this
archetype
way,
associated with the hero phase, where they sit
yes.
for a while, and oftentimes
Mhm.
the lover is associated with the growth of another character.
I think we see that with Ynez, and I think we will more in future episodes as well, because he's very much in this sort of teacher role with her in some ways. Someone who advises her, believes in her, and we touched on in the pre-show episode how they kind of embody the Tristan Isolde courtly love dynamic. That's further shown here through the teacher student role, where Tristan and was teaching Isolde, I believe it was an instrument, but here we see Kieran teaching Ynez sword fighting. And then they both have this moment where they imbibe in some sort of, well, for them it's the spice. For Tristan and Isolde, it was wine spiked with a love potion. And through this is when they deepen their love. Joseph Campbell makes it clear whenever he's talked about Tristan and Isolde that they fell in love prior to the love potion, but they were unaware of it. And then once they took the love potion, then it was like, there's no going back from here.
Mhm.
And I think that this is that similar moment because they clearly had feelings prior, but now they've fully expressed that relationship and taken it further.
They've tied the string of their relationship where they're going to be bonded basically together. Yeah. The next one is Constantine, which I'm actually not prepared to talk about. He is kind of showing off as like a vixen, which is that he's under parental or authoritative control,
Mhm.
and he is in a survival archetype. So vixens are
Yeah.
associated with survival and being aggressive to survive. He certainly comes off as an F boy or a playboy, but I mean, it could be misleading a little bit where he's at. So
Yeah.
need more from him, I think, to actually
Mhm.
fully judge what archetype he is in, but it's close enough to the maiden phase in
Mm.
some way.
Yeah. Emperor Javaco is in the puppet archetype.
Yes, so
Um,
this is associated with the king archetype. It is the passive version of it. So he's kind of led wherever other people will lead him. Oftentimes, the puppet is you've become king too early, and so you don't know how to actually manage yourself. But we see Kasha totally controls him, and he's controlled by other people as well. But I actually think that's because he's a sick king. They lean towards that, which is that a sick king is also a puppet, but a sick king is most mythologically associated with the Fisher King. Um, and if the kingdom is sick because the emperor is sick, then we see these symbols throughout the universe, i.e., the stolen spice, the houses that are not in a line, the fact that anyone can push him over. And truthfully, Hannah, I have a question for you. Do you think his
mm.
archetype will change with Desmond's interference?
Ooh, I think I know what you're poking at, and potentially. I've rewatched the trailers a little bit since then, and I'm thinking that potentially because in this episode, he's leaning on Kasha for advice, how to handle a situation, but then Kasha leaves. So she's not there for him to lean on. So he has to figure out what to do. And his wife tries to be there as someone for him to lean on, but he seems reluctant to go to her. But then there's Desmond, and he's presenting this other perspective that is juxtaposed to the sisterhood. And it's this totally other perspective for Jabako that I think is going to embolden him in his position. And he leans on Desmond, but I think it's going to be in a different way where Desmond wants to be his tool
Mhm.
in a way.
And he might
Like,
become aggressive and a tyrant, right? Like, we might see
yeah,
that.
I
And
think he's
so,
gonna. Mhm.
like, over the course of the show, I wanna deep dive into some of these character journeys a little bit more when we have opportunity, but right now we kinda have to just set the groundwork of what are we seeing? Where are they starting?
Mhm.
And,
Yeah.
he's definitely like a sick king puppet, and
Mhm.
it's interesting how well Mark Strong is coming off as this very unsure guy who's like, well,
Yeah.
I really don't want my daughter to marry a 9-year-old, but those fighters that they say I need
Yeah.
fighters. It's really funny.
It's
It's great.
I've seen people actually bring this up that they feel very impressed by his performance because he's almost playing against type.
He literally has no capability to lead out of a wet paper bag.
Nope. And I think because of that, it's why I think it's most likely that he'll transition into a tyrant because if he
Because he'll try
doesn't
to
know
come
who
up,
to
he'll
rule.
overcompensate. Yeah. Yeah,
Exactly.
and we'll see how that plays out and, like, what that means exactly as it happens, I think. Yeah, like,
Mhm.
like Desmond, but just briefly, like Empress Natalia, she is very protective, like, we have seen her, her actions. I would say that she is overly protective based on what we hear from Kasha. Um, TBD officially, but I think that we can call her a Snow Queen. She is
Yeah.
a Snow Queen is all about being passive protected. So you build a snow castle around your kingdom, and you protect your children to their detriment. You protect them
Mhm.
at the cost of their growth, and that's what we've seen happen with Ynez. And so I think we can like put it on there as a starting place and just take it back if we're wrong. At least that's what
Yeah.
she's presenting in this
Mhm.
episode.
'Cause she's certainly not a sorceress.
No. No.
So,
She's
yeah.
very passive. She lets Kesha, like, take over. She was
Mhm.
passive towards even Javico. She's extremely passive in her behavior and not at all balanced. Desmond is super interesting because he is very aggressive. He might not have been always aggressive. He might have been in a positive change arc previously when he was a hero of Arrakis.
Mm.
Tours as a soldier. A soldier is also a flat archetype, by the way. In the hero phase, he experienced something that made him go, oh, I need to go and change this in a very aggressive way, hurting others. He's
Mhm.
very willing to hurt others. We see that. And so, what most important is in his dark shadow negative archetype is that he's going to be playing an archetypical role to other people's journeys, probably as the predator. And we're going to dig into that in the episode itself with how it presents. I think it's fascinating that we called this from the trailers.
There was enough there that we could pick up on it, but I think that this episode completely leaned into that. It cemented that where he's in this bully archetype and he's going to start playing that predator role in other journeys, like you said.
He's the Darth Vader of this universe. He'd be the Emperor's right hand man,
Yeah.
Roy, the femme Jedi.
We've got our 4 new acolytes, these young sisters in training, and Sister Theodosia, we haven't seen much from her particular story,
Mhm.
but it's safe to say she's in a maiden archetype.
Yep.
But she hasn't been particularly passive or particularly aggressive as of yet. So this could change going forward.
Yep. And, yeah, all 4 of them are definitely maidens. We do see some more aggressive tendencies from some of them, and the
Mhm.
key thing about the maiden phase, and we've talked about a lot of maidens like Ynez and Constantine and, these girls, is that it's all about individuating away from the, society or the constraints of the society that you're in. You're on the
Mhm.
cusp of adulthood and you are trying to become an adult in society. We have all of these traditions around becoming an adult and venturing away from home and going off on your hero's journey. But you're still trying to figure out who you are in this phase. And so oftentimes the sort of bad guys in the story of a maiden will be just authority, so parental figures or society, or a predator.
And when we were talking about the trailers, we were talking about how it seemed like the sisterhood would be that overall maiden archetype, and that Desmond would represent that predator archetype, whereas the Imperium as a whole is that more organizational figure that the
Authority.
sisterhood is trying to. And I'm interested to see, like, will there be more predator archetypes that will develop over the show? And
Mm.
will Desmond play a specific predator archetype to any particular maidens?
And it could be that he might particularly pick on the low hanging fruit of
Mm.
our young acolytes just because they will be the easier prey of the
Yeah.
overall institution.
We definitely need a little bit more, but yeah.
Reverend Mother Raquella is actually, as we see her in the flashbacks, she's actually in her crone phase. So she's guiding the younger generation and she is heading towards a transformational experience with her death because when you transform symbolically in a story, you actually experience a life and then a rebirth. And she actually transforms into a mage. And how she does that is by transferring the knowledge and the wisdom of the ages to both Valya and also becoming the voice of their mothers that they can all, the voices of others that she can hear. So she is always with them, any of the mothers going forward.
Yeah. It's kind of, I think overall ancestral memory is definitely that representative of the mage phase within the Dune universe, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, yeah, it's awesome. And mages are commonly associated with people who could transcend to be part of the universe, but have chosen to stay behind and help out others. And so in Lord of the Rings, we have Gandalf the Grey transforming into Gandalf the White, but he rides around Middle Earth until he's ready to leave. In Star Wars, we have Force ghosts. And in here, we have the mothers who turn into the ancestral voices of the others.
And now we're going to get into some overall themes and mythic motifs that we're going to talk about for this episode.
They're laying the groundwork to be something that's going to be ongoing. And I was overwhelmed by the first one. It is everywhere. We saw a bit of it in the trailers, but I was shocked. I was shocked at how much there is. And this is the theme of consumption and the mythic motif of the House of Atreus, which I didn't say Atreides, although it is based on that. Consumption itself as a theme we see often in stories when there is an overwhelming destructive force within a story. Oftentimes it's representative by eating or greed. Oftentimes symbolically we'll see worms or serpents. The worm in Dune is a strong consumption motif. Fire is also a consumptive symbol. And so it's often personified in society as dominator cultures like capitalism and imperialism, which we also see behind the scenes in Dune itself as well. Endless greed. Fundamentally, we see that the solution of this is an Ouroboros, so a snake that eats its own tail to create the symbol of consumption, life, and rebirth. An Ouroboros represents alchemical union and thus rebirth. So it is fascinating to me that we see Ouroboroses everywhere. How this ties to the House of Atreus, it is the theme of consuming or eating of the children. Basically, it comes down to the idea that we are bargaining away our futures for something in the present. Of course, the House of Atreus is based on the Atreus myth, which starts with Tantalus, where he feeds his son to the gods, Pelops, and that's punished. Everybody is cursed in his entire story. There is death of children upon children, and it is eventually solved when there is no longer this continuous choice to consume the children, right? Selling out the future, consuming the children. But instead, the curse is broken when you are truly sorry for the consumptive cycle that you've been in and seek mercy, and somebody chooses kindness over vengeance. Because it's also related to vengeance. Vengeance endlessly creates this consumptive cycle, which we see. We see the consuming of the children throughout this episode, and we see the vengeance that is being brought by Desmond. This is the strongest theme that we have in this show so far, and it will drive this entire season.
And what's interesting is I think that because consumption, it's always been a theme in Dune, and it's been a theme that has lingered over the Atreides. And I think we'll see how that plays into how this curse of Atreus transfers into House Atreides and becomes this curse of the House of Atreides, where we see in Dune how there's this like sense of doom that looms over Paul's house. And the sense of like, what did Jessica do when she trained Paul in the Sisterhood's ways? she was sacrificing him to this larger plan.
Mm.
And like this continues on, and I think we'll see the seeds of how the consumption in the Imperium is connected to the consumption within the Atreides line.
Yeah, I mean, it starts out with, this is entirely based on a lie. Their power within the Imperium is based on a lie. So that lie is the start of the curse. It's already there, right? And it's cursing the land and the Imperium. Cool. Yeah, we're getting there, but what is this show?
What is the show?
Oh, yeah. So good. Feminine power and wisdom versus the patriarchy. What are your thoughts?
Well, one aspect of the sisterhood that I think is very clear from the get-go is because in Valya's opening narration, she talks about how the part of the reason why she connects with the sisterhood is because they're a group of women who are not ashamed of their power and they embrace it fully. And this pushes her to do more, and she wants to keep pushing it. And that's how we see how she's involved in the development of the voice. And we see how it comes out in a moment of pure rage, and she's not holding anything back. And I think that what's interesting about the sisterhood overall is they have such composure all of the time when they're outward facing towards the rest of the Imperium. But then when they're more private within their own space, they're able to express their power a lot more freely and cultivate it. And even in the Dune films, you can see that Jessica is a lot more composed around others. But when she's in private, she's incredibly emotional. Valya, she believes in this feminine power that this sisterhood possesses, and she believes in its capability to save the Imperium. As we learn, that the way that she's been going about it is maybe not the most efficient way of doing it. And I think it's because of the relationship that the sisterhood has with the overall patriarchy within the Imperium. Because so far they've been in service to the great houses and manipulating things behind the scenes whilst trying to position a sister as the empress of the Imperium, the one with all of the power. And that's why they want Ynez to marry Pruitt, because he's a child. So she'll always be in control. We haven't seen the sisterhood bring up the Kwisatz Haderach yet.
Yeah.
But he's so important to their entire mission. And I think that's what Valya is going to come to some terms with. This is something that Maureen Murdoch talks about when it comes to the relationship with the masculine and the feminine. When you come to this place with the goddess and you're wanting to reconnect with the great mother, at a certain point, there's this shift with how the feminine interacts with the masculine and the relationship that exists there. She says that when you've said no to the patriarchy, you have the space and the time to create something new and a new individual relationship with the masculine. That's not the masculine voice that was separated from the feminine throughout centuries of mythology. There's this separation between the masculine and the feminine. It's a creative masculine figure that leads you towards the great mother. And that's how you're able to ultimately heal that split with your own feminine nature. And I think that's what the idea of the Kwisatz Haderach is going to be.
The
for
feminine and
for
the
the
masculine and the feminine.
Paul aside, because I think everyone knows that Paul was not what the sisterhood was planning. But the concept of the Kwisatz Haderach is that he'll be trained in the way of the sisterhood, but he'll be under their control and their influence, and he'll be loyal to their way, but he'll have powers that they don't. And so it's very much a joining of the masculine and feminine in a different way that...
Alchemical union, as it were.
Yes,
and
exactly.
A solution to the endless consumption.
I think that's the realization that Valya is going to be having
throughout the season.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I do think that there's this idea that the answer to the universe is feminine power, and it's actually balance between feminine and masculinity in ourselves, right? Because this is all just a lens for our own internalized journey, and finding both of these things within ourselves, leading us towards a more balanced nature. I do think that also it's really important to kind of put it out there that feminine power doesn't come from anywhere. It always has
Hmm.
existed and is in the self. And so Valya having as strong a voice as she does, or the power that she instantly comes onto stage with, is because she is connected with her own feminine self. Joseph Campbell talks about how women, when they go on the journey, they don't need to go and fight dragons and figure out their power. They just need to figure out that the power was in them the whole time. This is the hidden goddess motif of feminine story. And the idea is through understanding natural wisdom, we realize the power has been in us the whole time. And that is very scary to people. It is scary to the patriarchy. It is what is the cause of much of our strife in the world from a patriarchal culture perspective. And this will be an interesting meta show to talk about with a lens to the fact that we have an entire order that is entirely focused on creation as its mission, creating, you know, whatever they're trying to create in opposition of destruction.
Another overarching theme that is not just this episode, but the whole series, it's named for this concept is prophecy. And what does prophecy mean? The vision of both Raquella and Kasha, they have the same vision, this idea of bloodshed and this sandworm that devours the sisterhood, and this trepidation over Inez's marriage and how that ties into the threat of Tyrann Arafel. And we know that Valya is trying to address this in one way, but at the beginning of the show, she gives us this thesis of what holds more truth, history or prophecy. And I think the way that we look at this show and we look at history and prophecy and what does that mean will be really important, because Frank Herbert has a very interesting perspective on prophecy that I think will be very much in alignment with the show. He says, prophecy and prescience, how can they be put to the test in the face of the unanswered question? Consider how much is actual prediction of the waveform, as Muad'Dib refers to his vision image. How much is the prophet shaping the future to fit the prophecy? What of the harmonics inherent in the act of prophecy? Does the prophet see the future, or does he see a line of weakness, a fault or cleavage that he can shatter with words or decisions, as a diamond cutter shatters his gem with the blow of a knife? So it's the idea of it's such a good quote, because his perspective isn't trying to answer that question so much as pose it to the people. And it makes you think, like, how much of this vision that Raquella and Kasha see, how much do their actions influence that and bring it to fruition?
Yep.
Right? Like, for instance, what would have happened if Kasha hadn't left?
Mm-hmm.
If she had stayed there, if she continued to have influence over the emperor, would she have handled that situation differently? There's just these questions of how much do the actions that these characters take bring us towards this vision that they're having, this prophecy that they're having, and how much of it is actually predestined? Can you fight against destiny? And I think what's interesting is that they specifically refer to Tyrann Arafel as a doom brought on by a tyrant, because what they describe is Paul.
Yep.
And the prophecy and the mission of creating the Kwisatz Haderach is something that I'm pretty sure they will go down that path in this show. But it is something that then, are they essentially creating Paul? Are they creating the
So it
Tyrann
becomes a
Arafel?
self-fulfilling prophecy in that. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's great. Are you ready to dig into the episode?
Yes. Oh my gosh.
So we start out with the voiceover, of course. But first we get the little line like, victory is celebrated in the light, but it is won in the darkness, which I love. And it's a
And-
fascinating play on mythic motifs and transformation, in that you can only transform in the darkness, in the underworld, when you are dead. You can only experience a rebirth in that. And then later on in the episode, she actually talks about transformation as something that the great houses, like some people need to be transformed. And so it's like almost
Mhm.
forcing this experience of transformation.
Yeah. And her narration starts, and that's what she brings up, what holds more truth, history or prophecy. And as she's saying this, the screen is enveloped by smoke and sparks. And we begin this episode with consumption. And this transfers into a flashback to the Machine Wars, also known as the Butlerian Jihad, where essentially humankind is enslaved by thinking machines that they create and employ, and it almost destroys humanity. We see some of this battle taking place, and uh, as we've mentioned, Valya says that it's said that an Atreides leads them to victory, but it was a Harkonnen, that her great grandfather, who fled. And because of that, since then, her house has been banished and in disgrace. But she says that this was born out of a lie, the Atreides lie.
I don't have a lot of thoughts on this. I'm just really excited to find out what that lie is. And to what we've spoken about
Yeah.
before, this is that house of Atreus. Like, we think this is the start of the curse, whatever the curse is,
Yes.
for the Atreides line. Um,
Mhm.
and then she goes on to talk about how she joined the Sisterhood and she chose a new family after being so disappointed with her own, who were unafraid of their true power. So, oftentimes, like from a heroine's journey perspective, again, this is Maureen Murdoch's feminine interpretation of the hero's journey using feminine symbolism and mythic motifs. At some point, you're in the man's world and you find that it's dissatisfying to you, and so you go on a heroine's journey to reconnect with the feminine. And so we see this as an experience that Valya herself and Tula go on to connect with the sisterhood. And she says, "I've met my true mother." Right? This is like,
Mhm.
voiceover wise, this is doing so much work for us because
Yeah.
she's given a new mentor. She's given this
Mhm.
wild mother. So much like Baba Yaga, Mother Raquel will teach her the ideas of balance and life and death. And she
Mhm.
absolutely does, because she's saying, like, the only way to avoid death is to have life, right? Is to have this control of life and to promote it. And she teaches her of the end death that they are all heading
Mhm.
towards, and that the only way to forge against it is to create, which is
Yeah.
so cool in just such a short period of
Yeah.
time.
And you can physically see, in just like when you cut from the flashback to what that particular room in the sister school looks like, you can see how much has changed in just the way that the landscape looks. There's some similar elements, like they have these chalice shapes in all of the walls and the architecture. But then in the current day, it's overgrown with moss
Mhm.
and it's wet, and the pool was there to begin with, but it's started to permeate kind of all around. Like the walls and the floor look wet and more damp. And obviously, like I said, the moss is like crawling up the walls. And
Yeah.
they have this device thing that's like floating over the pool now, that drops and makes ripples. So the center of the sister school is like a womb in a
Mhm.
way.
And actually, they go
It's
down where all their
Yeah.
secrets are kept and all of their important rituals, like, it's down underground, so it is this symbolic
Mhm.
womb, this earth goddess power that
Mhm.
they are drawing from.
And in a way, because of that, Valia having Dorothea kill herself in that location and how bloody it becomes, it very much evokes the idea of first blood, menstruation, and that step forward for Valia into adulthood, but also the maturation of the sisterhood itself. It's breaking through this particular
Transformation,
moment
yeah.
and transforming.
In the underworld themselves, or in this earth womb that they are in, the sisterhood itself is transforming out of this very maiden stage itself into this sort of
Mhm.
heroic establishment by which they are forging to fight dragons themselves.
Mhm.
I love seeing, like, Mother Raquel and her ring that she has. It is an Ouroboros. It's like a figure 8 symbol or an infinity symbol snake, which is one of the original Ouroboroses. So the other one is like the round one. And it's actually around a pinnacle. So it's sort of like an Aeschylus, the healing staff. And that
Mm.
is when you have a snake that is around that. It means that it's connecting you to transcendence. And so we have this idea that the Ouroboros is the way by which the symbol of the sisterhood will transcend its current way of thinking about
Mhm.
things. The Ouroboros is, of course, the idea of the answer to endless consumption.
Yeah.
The snake be eating its own tail. The snake being the symbol of consumption, but when it's eating its own tail, it's in balance. And so you have a
Mhm.
cycle of life and death and rebirth. And we have this rebirth that specifically happens in this moment of the sisterhood itself with a death and then a
Mhm.
rebirth of Valya through this moment.
She kind of accepts that her name will be on the wrong side of history.
Hmm.
It's almost like she's in this state of the past doesn't matter to her. It doesn't matter if the Atreides are deemed as these heroes in history because
Hmm.
she plans to change that. And it doesn't matter if her name goes down as a sort of villain or on the wrong side of history because this purpose for the sisterhood in the future is what's priority to her. So it's like
Hmm.
continually going forward. Things might happen, but you keep continuing the life, death, rebirth cycle.
Hmm. Exactly. And we hear that the prophecy is um, specific, like the images that we see Raquella sees, um, all of the different blood, flesh being consumed by the worm, the two eyes with the speaking stuff. We should talk about it in a second. But she says to Valya, and this is actually the curse, you will see the burning truth and know. Burning consumptive truth of what is the end. What is the end is this consumptive idea, and you will know, right, what it means in that moment. Not because of this vision. This vision is going to lead you down this wrong path, but you will see it in that moment with Kesha, which we see in this moment. It's
Mhm.
just so good. But let's talk about the vision. I love visions in
Yeah.
shows. I love them. They're so
It
weird.
starts with her eye. And we talked about this in the trailers
Mhm.
that like there was continual eye imagery and
Mhm.
both the vision that Raquella has and the vision that Kasha has later on, both of them keep returning to this eye and eye of God, eye as the universe
Mhm.
concept. It's continual throughout this episode from beginning to end.
And it's also
And so
tied to the worm,
mhm,
right? To
yes, that's
Shia-Lu.
the other thing.
It is tied to that, and I have
Mhm.
some thoughts on that.
It starts in this way where it's her eye, and then you get this, like, this sandstorm, and then you're on Arrakis, and she gets flashes of blood and violence and stuff, but the main core part of Raquella's vision in the beginning is we see this sandworm. The sister school is built out of sand on Arrakis, and then the worm comes in, and it dives down. It bursts through, and then it comes up, and the school is consumed and sinks into it, and what's so
Very
interesting about that
violent.
to me is it's very violent, and it makes me think of the belly of the whale
Mhm.
and the story of Jonah and the whale being
This is the
consumed by this beast.
yeah, and you have to be consumed to be transformed. Like, you have so
Mhm,
it's a motif of entering into the threshold of the journey. You have to be
mhm.
consumed by nature, basically. You have to be brought back to be consumed, and we see this again in the episode, but on a smaller scale. Do you remember when?
I'm actually blanking right now, but if you say it, I'll probably be like, "Oh, of course, yeah."
Near the end, the Emperor is watching Desmond be consumed by a worm.
Oh my god! Oh my gosh. No, but that makes perfect sense because, like, Desmond even says that, like, he should have died, but he didn't.
Mhm.
And then when he survived, he felt reborn. And
Yeah.
some stuff happened to him on Arrakis that
Yeah.
we'll learn more about.
He experienced a
But wow.
transformation. Yeah. He's on a
Yeah.
journey
Yeah.
himself. It's exciting to see
Mhm.
his journey, even though he's going to be the main antagonist, I think. Active
Yeah.
antagonist,
Yeah.
yeah.
But
But it's
I
cool.
really love that idea of being consumed by the beast and in the belly of the whale. And to me, even though it comes off as this fearful vision to the sisterhood, I think ultimately it's something that they need. This will
Mhm.
happen to them symbolically, and they'll need it. It'll be a major shift for them, which is kind of what the shadow is. And the
Yeah.
idea of like you're scared of it and you're fearful of it, but then you need to have that moment of joining and
Yeah,
facing each
where
other in
you
order to grow.
integrate your darkness. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
This is the key psychological motif in most story when you actually face the
Mhm.
shadow version of yourself or the thing that you're most afraid of. Okay, but let's talk briefly about the eye and the worm combo. So the eyes
Yes.
represent the soul, right? The soul and the idea that once you are able to experience an apotheosis, so a death and rebirth. An
Mm.
apotheosis means that you are connected with the soul of the universe or everything all at once. You experience the mask of God, which is that you come to the realization that there's nothing separating you from everything else in the universe, which is represented by Shai Hulud. Shai Hulud is God in
Mhm.
the Dune universe, right? Like that's
Yeah.
what Shai Hulud is. And then at the end of the vision, we get this universal thing with two eyes and this weird
Mhm.
language. I don't know what
I
that
have so
means
many
yet,
theories. It's
but
I don't know
there's
either.
symbolic things happening in the vision. A lot of people are like, that's robots, but no.
Okay, I don't know if it actually is. I think we're set up to assume that it's robots, but I actually think it's Paul slash the Quisatararak. Not
Mm,
literally, but in the sense of like that is the place where the sisters cannot look. That is the
yeah.
boundary that of their prescience that they can't
That's the end
go
to their
farther.
ideas.
And that's why it's so visceral. And like that moment always comes at the end of Raquel's vision and Kasha's vision is when we see that is near the end of their visions. And I think that that's where they're trying to see more and they're trying to get answers, but then they come up against this block. And I think that's going to also be part of why Valya will turn her attention towards creating the Kwisatz is because they recognize that there is a limit to their prescience and their visions can only tell them so much. And so they need to create a being capable of doing so. And they're going to realize that the reason is that they need the male line of ancestral memory. They
Mhm.
need the combination and the union of the masculine and the feminine in order to achieve this, which is coming back to what we talked about before about this union, this alchemical union. It's integral to what the Bene Gesserit need.
Which is just a
And
union of
they're so,
opposites. Like a union of
yes.
opposites.
And yeah.
Yeah.
And I think we'll learn more about prescience in the show and how important it is, but we're also going to see its weaknesses even more. But that's so far like what I
I
think
know.
those blue eye things are. But it's, yeah.
I
But
think we
it's
have a long
interesting
way to go,
also,
but yeah, it's cool.
yeah, it
Go ahead.
shows up in the galaxy background
Mm,
where it's almost as if they're stars. And again, like the eye, galaxy, universe,
mm.
God, that kind of, yeah.
Yep. They like God exists within us because all things exist within us at the same time. So it's an
Yeah.
interesting symbolic approach to
Mhm.
lay it all out there.
The idea of the mouth of the worm being the eye
Mhm.
and like the iris is really cool because it's like if you're seeing a worm, you're like staring down your death,
Mhm.
but it's also like you're staring into God, you're
Yeah.
staring into yourself. And
And
Paul has a
your
moment
soul.
like that in the
Yeah.
movie. Yes, it's just this maw. And the same thing happens for Desmond in that holo recording thing that the Emperor's looking at, where he's just kind of sitting there accepting at it, and this worm just like comes right at him. Um, and Kasha has it too in her vision, later on where the worm's coming down at her
And it's
and she's looking
swallowing the
up at it.
red-dressed woman who's, of course,
Mhm.
Ynez, right? So it's Ynez is
Yeah.
being swallowed at the same time as it's coming and
Mhm.
approaching her as the sand is dripping on her. It's cool.
But I'm pretty sure in Raquel's vision, though, it's from the opposite perspective. It's like if you were inside of the worm's mouth
Mhm.
and
Yeah,
looking
you
out.
see out. Yeah.
Mhm. Which
There's
so
still stuff
interesting.
to think
Yeah.
about. What do you think about it? It's wild to
Mhm.
everybody watching this. What did you see in this vision? Because it's kind of like an ink blot from a psychological perspective. You're going to see different things
Mhm.
based on your experience. It's just a mirror to your inner self when you look at stuff like this with
Yeah.
these deep symbolic images that are showing you on screen. Yeah. I love the funeral. She shrouds Raquel's
Mm.
body, and it's very honoring her to have her sort of true daughter, her birth granddaughter. That's who
Mhm.
we have in
Dorothea.
Dorothea. We have her granddaughter, and then her sort of true emotional or like
Mhm.
spiritual daughter being Valya, who's taking on the mantle of her work. They shroud her, this is all just very symbolic. And we hear the voiceover, like, we cannot split our purpose. And they head towards out. I'm not sure if they burn her or
I
imagine
couldn't
her
tell.
yeah,
It
down.
looks like it's on a
Like,
cliff.
yeah, they were
It's
just
like
having like a funeral. And what
yeah.
she's like, oh, I got to step forward and say some words to carry on her vision. And they instantly like, have a conflict with Dorothea and like the zealots of the
Mhm.
sisterhood talking about, um, you know, she's like, oh, we must push what it means to be human. And she's like, no, humility is our foundation of our virtues. The mind of men is holy. We must not disfigure the soul. So all this like purity, like it cannot do anything different. It's very like conservative versus
Mm.
sort of advancing politics in a way, or even language, right? So purity,
Mm.
conservative, must not change versus we must change or we will all die. Really fascinating that there was vultures up ahead, like, above, which
Yeah.
are psychopomps, so they are spiritual guides for the dead, and then also they're a symbol of death, rebirth, purification,
Mhm.
and being
Yeah.
able to embrace change.
And I think it's interesting that these two perspectives are coming from, you would assume, very different backgrounds as well. Like Valley is coming from a place of she has a probably more of a volatile family life and
Mhm.
upbringing, and so she sees the flaws within the Imperium structure, and that's how she's coming at her, like being part of the sisterhood and the sisterhood's mission. Whereas Dorothea, her grandmother was Raquella, and so this has been her, like, her origin, her family has always been the sisterhood, but she's tied to this perspective that people were having, during the Machine Wars, I think, and the idea that Raquella probably had initially.
Mhm,
And I think it's interesting that it's, like, sticking to the past or moving with the future,
mhm.
and why do you wanna stick to either perspective? And
There has to be a
yeah.
balance between the 2, right? Always.
Mhm.
Um, I this leads us to the inevitable conflict with Dorothea and so we know her brutal death with the voice. But we have this line where Dorothea says, like, we are the hand that points the righteous path. We are meant to guide the Imperium, not to rule it. And Value says, we must create the path and lead others to it. And it's very much like sort of
Mhm.
in my interpretation of what Frank Herbert is saying about prophecy, even.
Mhm.
Right? So,
Yeah.
like, it's like those 2 lenses, even just within the
And
show.
what I actually think is really interesting about that is because for Paul, there's and the Quisitorical role, there's something called the golden path,
Hmm,
which is like the timeline, the series of events that must happen in order for humanity to survive and to prosper. and to
Mhm.
avoid Krelizek. And how Paul does it is he can see all these possible futures simultaneously, and then he will try to make decisions that will um, adhere to a certain pathway. And what he comes up against is that certain things will happen not as how he saw them, and he'll have certain gaps in his prescience, which is why he has to then take the water of life in order for him to gain the clarity that he needs. But the sisterhood, or at least from Valya's perspective, when she talks about creating the path and leading others to it, that sounds exactly to me like the golden path and what the ideal of the Kwisatz Haderach is, which is this figure who can rule, who can see the right path, and who can then lead the rest of humanity down that path.
Mhm.
But then that's opposed to um, Dorothea, who's like, we cannot rule. That's not our rule. And Valya is in the position of, well, we need to have a sister on the throne because that's the way we'll achieve it, but not necessarily. And again, that's that. I think she'll have that change in perspective um, going
Based on the
towards creating
burning truth.
based on the burning truth.
Yeah. Um, and then we head towards sort of like the sisterhood above all, which love it. But then we head towards the 30-year change in the timeline, and we see kind of all the
Mhm.
symbolism of the change of the order, how much it's grown. You see like little girls, not just acolytes.
Mhm.
Um, you know, and we also see the power that Valya herself is controlling. Like
Mhm.
she has the ability to say no to a house that she just doesn't
Mhm.
like because she comes from the function, you know?
Yeah.
And then we're introduced to Constantine, who shows up at the at in the order to secure his sister's place in the order. And we get the like cute little banter with our Powerpuff Girls.
Yeah, they're it's a very I thought it was a very good moment because we learn later, a little bit later, that Emmeline doesn't come from one of the noble houses. So I thought that it was a more authentic way of explaining stuff that you would think everybody would already know. Like you would assume that, like, oh, Theodosia knows that these are Imperial guards. Like you'd assume all these people would know who Constantine is, but maybe Emmeline, who doesn't have many connections to the noble houses, she wouldn't necessarily recognize Constantine or know what his deal is. So I just thought that was a really authentic way of delivering that exposition, because we understand that that makes sense, and it's a really interesting way of introducing him as well because we see that he's um and if like he's a spokesperson for the emperor. He's able to barter these sorts of things, but he has no claim to the throne whatsoever because he's
Yeah.
not legitimate.
And no
Um,
power of his own too. And,
mhm.
I mean, I don't know if this has already been confirmed, but he's totally the son of the 4th sister we haven't seen.
Francesca, yeah.
Um, I love the whole talk about, humanity's greatest weapon is the lie. And then they talk about how, people who lie are survivors. And of course, I love
Mhm.
this so much because it ties into the fact that shadow archetypes are all about they're the answer to a problem. They're not actually the
Mhm.
problem, they're the solution. They're the reason that people are able to survive in situations that they don't feel like they can control. So, why do you have a vixen being a vixen? Well, they're being aggressive because they're trying to survive in the situation that they're in, and they haven't
Mhm.
figured themselves out enough to forge out of this situation. And yeah, eh, we lie to our enemies, we lie to our friends, we lie to ourselves. This is entirely my jam. I loved it so much, and it shows the deep thought that went into
Mhm.
this story.
It's so interesting that this is also the first lesson that we see, because this whole
Yeah.
episode we continually see these girls going into class and the different lessons that they have, but we specifically start with a lie. What does that mean? And centering it as like why being a truth sayer is so important and what truth
Mhm.
sense means. And we'll see how that comes into play and in later lessons that they do when we get to that point in the episode. But yeah, I think it's such a good choice to start with this, I think. Yeah.
It's interesting because we've been seeing it framed as this like power, right? That they gift to
Hmm.
the great houses. But it doesn't mean that the Bene Gesserit don't lie themselves, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
Or
And
exclude the truth.
that's true. Yeah. And I
Like
think
we
that's
have seen instances with Kesha, right?
yes, definitely. And I think, well, because the other thing is, oh, are you technically lying or are you just omitting the truth?
And we get to go to our ruling planet,
Mm.
Secundus. Is that the how you pronounce it?
Yes. Seleucus Secundus. It's what's so interesting about this is it's the original homeworld of House Carino, and it's the original ruling seat of the Imperium. But this changes because by the time of Dune, they're ruling from Kaitane. And that's where we see Christopher Walken and Florence Pugh hanging out in Dune Part 2. And Seleucus Secundus is actually this desolate, rainy prison planet that we see in Dune Part 1 when David Dismalchin's character Piter, he goes there to get Sardaukar for the Baron, and that planet is Seleucus Secundus, and it becomes this prison planet that's like this
What
brutal
happened?
place where the Sardaukar. I know, it's so
Yeah,
interesting. It's so lush in this show.
it's at some point in the future things go horribly awry for this planet.
Mhm.
Yeah. Great, but we cut to Ynez and Kieran, the sword master, training in the. It was very sexy. It was great. I
Yeah.
loved it. He kicked her ass. Like he was
Oh,
being
yeah.
kind to her, but she sucked.
Speech you.
Yeah, and then
Yeah.
like they have this like moment where he touches like 3 points on her chest.
Yeah, and it, like, lingers, and she, like,
Yeah.
looks down, is like she's like, "I'm not paying attention to learning anything, you're too hot."
I'm like, they're in each other's physical space so much. So of course they have this chemistry to our point. Like
Mhm.
it's very Tristan and Isolde, like before they take the potion.
Mhm.
So we have that motif itself. Tristan and Isolde is Joseph Campbell talks a lot about how it's like the ultimate version of courtly love and overcoming the ideas of authority in in the face of what you actually truly desire. So the idea of like
Mhm.
discovering what you want for yourself. And so this is really important to Ynez as a lens because again, Kieran is in this
Mhm.
flat archetype as a
Yeah.
lover. He's not doing anything but just helping her on her journey at this moment.
Mhm.
But it's really important for her to discover what she truly wants and whether she wants to be bound by different authorities, etc., trapped in different pieces, or if she wants to forge her own path.
What I think is also really great about this scene is it's it establishes really easily the intimacy and connection between them, but also the boundaries that currently are being maintained between them.
Mhm.
And what becomes interesting about that is, as we get to later, her mother is almost encouraging her to go against those expectations and boundaries. Um,
Yeah.
and she's choosing to adhere by them. Which goes along with like,
She literally
I
goes
mean,
and makes her decisions based on the like walls that she could put her in the boxes she could put herself in instead of forging her
mhm.
own path. in her own way, like a true leader would do. Um,
Mm.
yeah, it's interesting.
And I think in a way, like, if Ynez if she were able to keep going on this journey, I actually think she would end up in the same place that her father is at right now as a
Mm.
puppet. Yeah.
We see the marriage alliance scene after Constantine arrives, and they have that cute hug and everything like that. And
Yeah.
I mean, it established very quickly that they have a good sibling relationship, which is great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but then we see the marriage alliance scene, and we're supposed to feel super duper
Oh, yeah.
uncomfortable. We don't like the Racheses; they suck.
Mm-mm.
And I love
Yeah.
the fact that like the Bene Gesserit are talking to each other out loud for the Emperor
Yeah.
and the Racheses, and then they like communicate with their hands to be like, hey,
Mhm.
this is a bogus deal. You shouldn't go with it. And Kesha, who's like actually the king archetype of the kingdom right now,
Yeah.
is like, no, 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 this is really important because she's one of the core
Mhm.
four of the sisters that
Yeah.
were forged in fire so long ago and
Yes.
are ruling.
Because the sisters are using their sign language to communicate. They're bartering over this whether or not the Racheses will have their own wing in the royal house to help with the transition and bartering over these ships. But their conversation is completely unimportant. It's
Mhm.
completely off to the side and just kind of like you can sort of hear them in the background, but they're not important. It's the silent hand gestures that the sisters are
The
doing
hidden
and their
hand.
conversation. The hidden hand.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
they do a lot with show don't tell in these moments, and I'm really hoping for more of this. So
Yeah.
we get kind of like a cut to the sisters training and a little bit more of like that. We understand a little bit more of what they've got going on.
Mhm. We get some intercuts with them physically fighting, but the main class at this point is they're brought these prisoners from the imperial prison, and they're naked so that there's no barriers to
Mhm.
confuse the acolytes so they can just perceive them. It's not just this person's lying necessarily or this person's being truthful, but Dosia, I think she goes first, and she says her words are true, but her intent is to deceive.
Yeah.
Then Jen doesn't say whether or not her person was lying or not, but she says, "Is this the best that you could get?" Kind of cocky.
Yeah.
Is like sauntering back, and then Valya's like, wait a second. If you think it's so easy, tell us why you're here."
Yeah.
And then she goes into her backstory, which is a really horrible story.
Mhm.
Um,
But
but
she
then she
kind of
laughs it off.
yeah, and sort of presents it like she was lying, but some of it was true. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think this connects to Um, I think it's coming up soon where it's like right after this they have these tests um and I'm jumping a little bit ahead here, but there's this scene between Valia and Tula where they're discussing which of the acolytes they should have paired with Ynez because
Mhm.
acolyte bonds are forged in fire, so it's really important that they have the right girl. And Valia comments to Tula about Lila and how like timid she is, but then Tula says that she's a natural born empath, and because of her lineage, she'll be one of the most powerful truth sayers they'll have. She's very much a damsel because she keeps to herself. But then again, jumping forward, she talks to Jen at night, and she basically says that she knows that she was lying, but there was truth to what she was saying. If you believe it to be true, does that make it truthful? If Jen hadn't laughed it off, everyone there would have believed her. But then also her laughing it off makes them believe that she's wrong. That's why I really liked what Theodosia said about her
Mm.
words were true, but her intent was to deceive. Because I think that exemplifies what is this really about? What is this skill that they're really trying to learn?
Absolutely. Yeah. Back on the ruling seat, we have Ynez and Natalia prepping for the engagement ceremony and her putting on the corset and the different fixings, sort of like putting on her armor, which is really cool. Leading even the like the veil, the metal veil is kind of
Mhm.
like a helmet or a shroud, and a lot of this conversation about how Ynez wants to take a hold of her own path and everything like that. This is her like trying to go through her own threshold to adventure.
Mhm.
Like she is trying to
Yeah.
become the ruler and the hero of her own story. And
Mhm.
really trying to leave behind being a damsel. Like she really is
Mhm.
leave behind being a maiden
Yeah.
and go off on her own. But she is signing up for 10 more years of being under the authority of somebody else, and then also not
Yeah.
really choosing like, her own path herself. She's letting other people choose it for her, so
Mm.
I'm not quite convinced she's ready to leave that, but
No.
we'll see.
Yeah, but like you were saying, Natalia's almost right with everything that she's saying to
Mhm.
Ynez. But at the same time, she fills this too good mother role
Yep.
that Maureen Murdoch talks about in terms of the separation from the feminine, separation from childhood. And that's really what the too good mother is. This is my safe place for you, and I don't want you to leave it.
Mhm.
I want you to do these things that I know will protect you. In a sense, Ynez should be able to make her own choices, to make her own mistakes, to
Even
be
if
her
they
own
are mistakes,
person,
yeah.
even if they are mistakes. But Natalia's wanting to prevent her from that. We think with good intention, but in a way it prevents her from going on her own journey. Essentially what she's saying is she wants Ynez to be her the way when she
Mhm.
was younger. Because Natalia's the one who brokered the marriage between her and Havako. And she says that like if if you would take my advice or whatever, you would rule how you want and marry who you want. But that would be Ynez being Natalia and not Ynez being Ynez.
Yep. Yep,
Yeah.
exactly, and, right after this, we're presented with the force by which I think will play into Ynez's growth, which is, we enter Desmond straight from Arrakis, holding a piece in his hand, and I zoomed, and I sent it to you, and I was like,
Yes.
"This is the sister cloak." It actually is the
Uh-huh.
like, the design that's on their shoulders of their cloaks that
Yeah,
they
it's like
wear outside.
it's like right around this area.
That
Yeah.
line. Yeah. And we talked earlier about how Desmond is representing this predator. And I have a little
Mhm.
bit I want to read from Cam Willand, who's quoting both Maureen Murdoch and also Women Who Run with the Wolves, Clarissa Pinkola Estes. The predator represents the toxic animus or masculine force within the maiden. This is part of her, whether externally represented or in a conflict or not, that would destroy her by blocking her consciousness from her individualization and true empowerment. So we do think that Desmond's going to be this force that's blocking, especially the sisterhood, from their, becoming.
Mhm.
But the predator often is represented as a destructive or devouring force apart from the authority figures. So a third player that is
Mhm.
this destructive and devouring force that the maiden must escape and overcome. And in some ways, uh, join with, right? Because it's like a symbolic union to take in your shadow self, etc. I just thought that was super interesting because what we see Desmond almost presenting himself when he's speaking with the Emperor is he's not very good at speaking with people. He literally is playing
No.
with the rings on his fingers the whole time, which is a tell. He's nervous, he's thinking, he's worried. Certainly could be lying or he thinks what he is doing is true. The predator is associated with the folklore fairy tale of Bluebeard, where
Mhm.
there is a marriage of sorts, right? So I feel like he's going to enter into the empire and find a place in it. You have to do everything that he wants you to do, except for open the door in the basement with all of his dead wives, right? So you have to
Yeah.
behave exactly the way that he wants you to behave. And you cannot use this feminine power and wisdom that you have within yourselves So he's going to try and box the sisterhood
Mhm.
into a corner with how they behave and what they do, I think.
Yeah. I definitely think he's going to climb the ladder and grow how much Havako trusts him.
Yeah. So he lies or he says what he believes to be true. Kesha is in this moment where, she's uncomfortable with him, and we hear
Mm.
the voices, the other voices of the others in the background. Like the sound design is doing a lot of work. It's good.
Yeah.
But then we cut
Oh, yeah.
to her at night and she's in all white. She's in this like very pure, like pajama outfit. And
Mhm.
she has the vision, but it's like more. And the things that are
Mhm.
added are more personal. Like again, visions are like
Mhm.
your own view of the collective unconscious. And so she's very much worried about Ynez. And so we have the red dress with the barefoot feet, and we have the blood trailing behind the train, and we have the pomegranate in front of the throne with just a dress on it. But it's
Yeah.
like maggots and like rotting inside
Mhm.
of the pomegranate, which we don't know the symbol of until later, which is great.
Yes.
And then we see Valya, like it's half a millisecond, sitting
Yeah.
on the throne in black and white. Like, they actually made it, like, black and
Yeah.
white, and then we have, Kesha's hand out catching sand, Ynez above in the dress, but it's actually the sisterhood pool.
Yes. Kasha's standing in like a pool of sand, and then she's looking up, and Ynez is in the pool in the
Yeah, and
sisterhood.
it's like the throne
And
room
it's
to the sisterhood pool because she's in the throne room
yeah.
in the sisterhood pool, and then Ynez is blaming her, but it turns into the worm, and then we have the flashing light
Yeah.
voice, machine voice again.
Uh-huh.
Whoa.
And Ynez is saying like, "You did this, you did this."
Yeah.
And yeah, the moment where it transforms into the worm and then you see it's such stunning visuals. Then right after, she's feeling herself being burnt
Mhm.
because there's nothing on her arms, but she's looking at them as if there's something that she's seeing and that she's in
Mhm.
pain,
She
which is
immediately
so
goes
interesting.
and visits Ynez, and
Yes.
then, we hear this story about how, "Remember when my sisters and I found you, a child held captive for years?" And I think that this is symbolic. Like, I am leaning towards this idea that your power discovered within you, but
Yeah.
you weren't able to utilize it. Your mother was treating you like this damsel, and you weren't able to discover your own feminine power because I
Yeah.
wasn't allowed to hang out with you and you weren't allowed to become a sister. But we knew that
Yeah.
one day you would lead our Imperium to a better future, and then she
Mhm.
kisses her head, which is unfortunately, she's also a too good mother in this moment
Yeah.
for Ynez, but she leaves. And so this is her getting out of the way of Ynez's journey too.
Yes.
Because oftentimes parents and these mentor figures have to leave, have to let the child go, or have to die for the child to actually advance into adulthood. This is all symbolic.
Yeah.
This is a symbolic thing that happens in stories.
Yeah.
But with the death of the mentor is so classic in
Yeah.
story. It's so archetypical that we see it all the time because I'm it's a lot easier for people to grow beyond their mentor if their mentor's like just not even in the story anymore.
Yeah. And Kasha leaves because she's like, I need to say this stuff to Valya and to the sisters. They need to know this.
Mhm.
But the intention is actually for Kasha to return. Like she
Mhm.
tells the emperor that like I'm gonna be gone for the engagement thing, but I'll be there for the wedding.
He's a puppet. He's genuinely upset that she's missing the engagement
Yeah.
but nope, she'll be back for the wedding.
And in that moment when Kasha's not there, that's when Natalia tries to
Mhm.
sort of get a little bit of influence back. She like touches his hand and is like, "You used to listen to me and we shouldn't go through with this marriage." And then he's like, "We remember things differently."
Loves that sister. He
Yes.
loves her. This is coming out.
I'm
Drama.
so excited for that. I'm so excited for when she shows up. But I'm curious if his relationship with Francesca is part of his loyalty to the sisterhood.
How old is Constantine? Is he older or is he younger?
Ooh, the Ynez? I don't know. They look like they're probably around the same age, but if I had to guess, I would say he's older. He feels like an older brother.
Yeah, they certainly do seem to be playing it that way. Yeah, it's just interesting
Yeah.
because it's like, when did the breakdown of this marriage happen? Or was it broken from the beginning too?
Yeah.
You and I remember things different. We had already talked about kind of like the maiden roll call, introducing us to our maidens, Theodosia, Lilia, Jen, and Emerline. Uh, but it was good to hear them talk about them, so we got a little bit more
Mhm.
because I feel like the story is going to focus a little bit on them. Why
Mhm.
spend so much time introducing them if they're not going to be important? So I do think they
Yeah.
will have like a role. They spent time to give us their character sheets. Like,
Yes.
and
Yes, they
also their
did.
flaws and their positives. They spent time to engage with these people, so they're important to the story. But we see that Kesha has arrived, interrupting this conversation. She arrives unannounced, and she's like, "You got to listen to me. This is like the
Oh,
craziness." And Valya's like so like, I don't know, egotistical. And she's like,
oh,
I'll see the burning truth. And this is where I'm like, she's definitely an aggressive version of an archetype. I
mm,
just still don't think that she's the king in the king, like,
no.
life archetype phase, because the king is the one who's out there representing the kingdom. And she's still at home trying to nurture the sisterhood and
Yeah.
get it to be where it needs to be. And so that's why, like, I definitely think that she's a sorceress, this aggressive
Yeah.
queen archetype where she's like, I'm
And
going to push my tendrils into everything and I'm going to grow my brood.
but she doesn't have the immediate influence over the Imperium that the Emperor does. Or like, for instance, Kasha, she's in a balanced king archetype.
Mhm.
But then Valya, if she were the truthsayer to the Emperor,
She would
then
be a
she'd be the
tyrant.
tyrant.
Yeah.
But she's not.
No.
And
So I'm
really
relating to some
curious
of
what
that
her
because I
plans
feel
will
like
be.
as she steps into the light, like she'll become more active and aggressive, and in the light, she'll become a phase in her own right. But it'll be really really interesting to see and talk about like what it
Yeah.
means as well. Because like kings are like they step into it because like basically leadership is thrust upon you, and although she's been in
Mm,
this leadership mode, she hasn't been the face of the sisterhood. Kesha has been. She's
yeah.
the one who's standing
Yeah.
next to the emperor. Cut
And
to
I'm
that
I'm curious.
engagement.
Oh my gosh. That engagement is so disturbing.
So we have the Richezis enter in, and I am obsessed with the fact that they played up in even the costuming how young Pruitt Richezi is. He's got his little short and he's wearing his little knee-high socks. Like,
Yeah.
and his clothes almost look overly big on him.
Yeah.
Like, a little bit like they really played this up to make him look even
Mhm.
younger than 9. I actually wanted to check out how old the actor was, but I couldn't figure it out. Um, he looks younger than 9 to me. I don't know.
Yeah. He's a really great actor though, in terms of like how child actors are.
Yeah,
He did an incredible job in this
he
episode.
did, yeah. Um,
And then even the ring that he has on is also really big compared
yeah.
to his hand.
Like, everything is
Oh,
oversized, like, he's definitely, like, the puppet that the Duke Richezi is trying to put on the throne. He is this puppet,
yeah.
like, that is how he's presenting, and then we had the grossest line in existence. Duke Richezi, like, "May Richezi seed find purchase in royal soil." Like, gross. And
But
then
but
we
then you
get,
get
like,
this
this
shot.
of her walking down the stairs, and
Oh,
it's
yeah.
beautiful. We have this golden, like, thing between them. He's on a little box because he's so tiny, and, they open it up, and, they have, pomegranate seed in
I
there.
love that you brought those. Yeah.
And I'm gonna eat them, and it's gonna get more awkward as we talk about the symbolism. Because as you stare around
Oh,
the room and they do these activities, people react. Like, they did a great job of, like,
mm,
flashing to his mom or his sister, and she's like,
mm.
and flashing to Constantine, what
Yeah.
seems like, ugh,
It's
and
like,
then it ends on the reaction of the emperor, who's like, I am making a terrible decision.
Uh-huh.
Oh, it's so awkward. But
Like, so
pomegranate.
yes, pomegranates. The idea of a pomegranate is it's very tied to fertility. In the trailer episode, I mentioned that in the very specific tradition, they'll like throw it at a wall and the seeds will be how many children. But then eating a pomegranate is something that's supposed to boost fertility. And
It's
so
an
since this is,
aphrodisiac. It is an
yes.
aphrodisiac. It's supposed to make you like horny.
And so the reason why this is part of the engagement ceremony is it's supposed to be this like ceremony of saying that there will be intercourse within this union. It will be a consummated union. It will be a union
Yeah.
that creates children as the groom is a child.
Yeah. And like bad, right? But then like she's like, hey, here's your pomegranate, and was gonna feed it to him, and he's like, I'll take it and take it to myself. And then she makes him feed it to her, right? Like, cause she's like, I'll do it, like you do it to me. And he has to like move like that aside, which is vulva like and like a seed in. It is so gross. They managed to make it so gross, and with the symbolism involved in what a pomegranate represents, and the fact that the
Yeah.
guy said seed and purchase, like it's so gross. Everybody knows this is supposed to be wrong.
What they also do that I think enforces even more so that you're supposed to hate the entire idea about this is Pruitt's kind of a little piece of shit.
Yeah,
Kind
because
of a
he
little
has to
bit.
talk. This is just a formality.
Yeah. And he's very much like, my dad says this, my dad says that all the time.
Yeah.
So the influence over Pruitt is his father.
Mhm.
And that is the threat that Javaco's kind of like dealing with. Because
Yeah.
Ynez is coming from the perspective of he's a child, so I will have so many years of freedom to myself before he's an adult and we have to actually be married and act like we're a married couple.
Is that this gives the kid 10 years and the family
Yeah.
to get like under the skin of the empire and like the Imperium
Exactly.
and like dig their claws into everything, which is the concern that the one sister who supports the House Rattesi anyways is concerned about. Like, you got to watch out for this guy. And they're like, no, it's most important that this marriage happens. No, it's not. It's not good. Everybody's like, their skin is crawling, and when you think about the symbolism behind it, it's literally horror on Mark Strong's face, that horror, and then he's a puppet, so he just falls in line.
I think you mentioned it during the trailers, but you get shots further back and there's petals, rose petals everywhere, and her dress has like a flowing train, like blood everywhere, and all of this symbolism around.
Yeah, and like her
intercourse
face
and-
looks like a funeral shroud too, like her veil.
Yeah.
And like so it's like a death and rebirth, and of course that's also like what seeds represent. Seeds are meant to be planted in the ground to birth new trees and things like that. Like there's so much things happening in this one moment, but it's gross as hell.
Yeah.
Wild.
After this, we cut to sort of the party
After
following
party, yeah,
afterwards.
the reception,
Yeah.
and
I
think they focus on him. He's looking like
Yeah.
fine. He's playing his little like
He's playing a balisette.
yeah.
I love that he's playing a balisette. Like that got me so excited. I was like, thank you for giving me a balisette. And then all of the ladies are watching him.
Yeah, like definitely giving off Vixen bad boy vibes, right? Like I mean, I would say like we'll see, but he's leaning in that direction. And we have this great scene with Harkonnen, who's talking about whale fur trade, and he's like, not just the fur, the seed. And I'm like, we've already had too much of your seed, sir. We've had too much competition about seed. No,
And that's when the emperor's like, okay, I'm gonna go away now.
this guy was just talking about seed, and he's like, I'm disgusted.
Yeah.
Like it was great. It was
Yeah. But what's also really good is it that whole moment, it shows you the position that the Harkonnens still have within the Imperium. He was talking to the emperor, but the emperor was like, I don't care about a single thing
Yeah.
that you were saying.
Yeah, and being
Um,
ignored basically, and like,
yeah,
I would rather be elsewhere, thank you. And also,
yeah,
this actor is so removed from the Harkonnens that we see in the
yeah.
movies. Love it, Valya and Tula as well. Like they're just so
Mhm,
removed. I'm excited to dig into that, like what they're like in their home planet, because we kind
mhm.
of can see like
Yeah,
the journey to what they become, which I think will be really cool as well.
yeah.
Um, but we have Ynez and Pruitt like sitting there on their rose-colored dais.
And different royal houses are going up to pay their respects and give
Mhm.
blessings and stuff. And they just kind of have to sit there until everyone gets a turn.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and
and he's playing
Pruitt,
with his little
being an
thing, yeah.
being a 9-year-old, he's getting bored,
No.
so he wants to play with his little toy. And this entire time, Ynez has been trying to be nice to him
Mhm.
because I think that he's
She's
just
like,
a kid, but she's going to have to be married to him eventually. So she's trying to start it off on a positive
I get the
note.
impression that the wedding is literally, like, next week. Like,
Yeah.
it's, like, next week because he says Kesha will be back in time for the wedding.
Mm,
So, quite literally, she's gonna be coming right back, and the engagement is, like, right before the wedding.
yeah. And but then like Ynez will be well, actually, I think it's like 2 days away.
Yeah, because then
Because
she
later
leaves, right? She
and then
gets
she's
married.
because she says to Kieran, in 2 days' time at some like later in the episode, she says to him, in 2
Maybe
days'
the
time,
wedding is
I'm
the
going to be on
next
an
night. It's
yeah, it's
the
like
next
yeah, it's
night.
like right away. They're getting married right away, and then Ynez is going to the sisterhood. And yeah. But she's trying to be nice to him, but then he was kind of like bit of a little rude to her during the engagement ceremony. But now she's like, come on, you can tell me what it is and stuff and like show me what you're
Mm,
playing with. He pulls it out.
and
And
it's a
it's this little ball
salamander,
that turns into a salamander,
and
a
I'm
robot
obsessed.
salamander.
I'm
Yeah.
gonna go into it a lot more on what it means, but salamanders are associated with fire consumption.
Yeah.
Salamanders are, psychopomp, they go between, but they're also associated with fire.
Where do we start this episode? We start this episode with flame and smoke consumption. And the first scene that we see is the machine wars. And
Mhm,
then we have the first time we see another piece of thinking technology, or more advanced technology, is the salamander.
mhm.
And they choose a salamander because
Could've
the
been anything, it could've been
little
like a little walking robot or anything. No, 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 it's like an
mm,
animalistic, symbolic choice of a salamander. It looks like a salamander.
yeah.
I'm losing my mind. It's so good.
And this scene is so interesting because Natalia lashes
Freaks
out
out.
and she's like so mad and scared. And Natalia's like, this is my opportunity to make sure that this marriage doesn't actually happen. If everybody agrees that they've done something illegal because these machines are forbidden, then we can't have this marriage go through. But then Ynez probably recognizes this and she's like, no, I need this marriage to go through so that my plans can happen. And I think that's why she's protecting Pruitt. But then Desmond uses his
He
knife to, like,
hunts like a
stab the
predator.
salamander. Yeah. He stabs it, and then he just kinda, like, has it on the end of his knife, and then the Duke Richese comes up, and he's like, let's be reasonable here, it's just a toy, it's not that big of a deal." And then Havoko comes up, and the Duke's like, "Come on, tell her that it's not a big deal."
Yeah.
Like, and he's, like, telling him what to say.
Yeah, and
And
because he's been, like,
and
sort
you
of
can
trained by Kasha that this is
mm.
best for him, like, even though she's not anywhere near him, he totally falls in line.
And Natalia's looking at him like, say something. Say that this isn't okay. Because Natalia has this great line where she's like, you exist because the Karinos defeated thinking machines. And
Yeah.
so I think honestly, Natalia's quite disappointed in her husband,
I think she loves him.
but she's
There's
disappointed in how things have turned out.
Mhm.
And he ends up saying a sort of in-between statement of, let's let this go for now.
Yeah.
So like it's like his out statement of we're still letting this marriage take place, but technically, maybe if they did something else,
I could bring it
we
back
would
up.
we would
Yeah.
stop it. Yeah. And then he turns to leave and he has this exchange with Desmond where he looks at him and you can tell that Javaco wants some sort of reassurance or guidance in that moment and he's turning to Desmond for it, which is really interesting.
And yeah, this leads us into Ynez and Constantine and the quiet limbo going clubbing,
Yeah.
which is like, there's only so many clubs, I guess, in the universe and in the ideas of people because it's like, it's literally like what clubbing looks like in any sci-fi show. But it's fine. They
Yeah.
take some spice because they're not going where they were supposed to be going. And it's basically like her Bachelorette in a way. Like,
A
in a
little
way.
bit.
And that's sort
And
of like
it's
how that plays out with Tristan and Isolde too, like her Bachelorette. Did you want to talk about that scene briefly before we dig
I
into the kind of the end stuff? Because it's all kind of together, the Emperor stuff with Desmond and then how it leads out to the end.
Yeah. And so when they get to this this club, this place called Division, which I think is an interesting name choice. Ynez and Constantine kind of split up. Constantine goes and finds people, I guess, that he knows and starts having some spice. Ynez goes to this bar and she's presented with these spice canister things, and someone moves out of the way, and then she sees Kieran there,
Yeah.
and they're both kind of like, "Oh, we're both here." And she's like, "Do you want to share? Do we want to actually take it to the next step now?" In this moment is our first time where we see Michaela. She's an off-world Fremen. So she's one of the bartenders or people who works here. She walks in and you can see her blue eyes. And when Ynez and Kieran are having this exchange, she's like, "Atreides, is everything okay?" And then Ynez is like, "Yeah, we're fine." And
Yeah.
then she's kind of like, her eyes are kind of following Kieran as they walk away. And then
Oh,
Kieran
she
like looks
likes
back at
him.
her. Oh, 100%. And I'm like, I cannot believe we have another Atreides, Carino, and Fremen love triangle.
What are we doing here?
The story is old as time.
Yeah. There's only ever one
Um,
story. Uh, Yeah. No, it was great. And they go off into this like sort of side room. It's not really, it doesn't really even have a closable door, but a private area because there is sort of a
mm,
gate that closes behind them, but they kind of wander through crowds of people that are getting it on and also vaping. And
like sort of rooms along the
yeah,
walls in that area.
and like lots of
Yeah.
pillows. Like, it gives off
Mhm.
like sci-fi hookah club, like a little bit, you know. And then they take the aerosolized spice and like it's very you know, when you share something, it's an indirect kiss, and so that's what this is
Mhm.
representing, but then it immediately goes from 0
Yeah.
to
But
100.
it's so good in the terms of the indirect kiss because she inhales it, and then he's, like, looking at her really intensely, like, he's,
Yeah,
like,
and then she
waiting
blows it
for
at
it,
him.
and then she blows it at him, and he has this, like, euphoric reaction. They're slowly easing into the kinda intimacy that they wanna have with each other, and it goes from 0 to 100 the
And
moment that
he's
they
like,
start
"Wait a
getting high on
second, you're
spice.
you're getting married," and she's like, "Yeah, but I'm
Like,
also leaving."
this entire scene was so femme gaze, in my
Mhm.
opinion, because, like, he took off his
She was in
shirt, she
control.
was in control, consent.
So
She was
sexy.
just having a blast. She was having a blast.
Confirmation of love. A
Yes.
union, right? Like, they had a union, which means that they're both gonna be transformed. I think that this will push Kieran out of his sort of, "I'm the lover, I have to become the hero"
Mm,
phase, maybe. We'll see what happens with
mhm.
him, and she herself will be, of course, transformed because this is a step into adulthood. This is an
Yes.
initiation of sorts into, and it's funny, like,
Mhm.
it's dark, they're underground, it's
Mm.
very comfy, cozy in there. This is the
Yeah.
this is an experience of
Mhm.
adulthood.
It's a transition into adulthood for her that is done in secret, and if she weren't to have done this, she would have stayed in this very maiden, childlike phase, and then
And
she's gonna
then
go and
going to
spend 10
go and become a
years,
nun.
and she's gonna be an acolyte, she's gonna be one of the sisters in a
A child.
child role. And she's going to continue that phase, but in this moment, she's going against that and she's connecting with her adulthood and her femininity in that
And
way, her own sexuality.
And in so many ways, like Tristan and Isolde is all about personal desires over the desires of society, the church, and authority. And
Mhm.
the symbolism is so heavy and strong in this. It's like it feels so purposeful. Like, they
Yeah.
reading the same books as us? Like Ursula K. Le Guin talks about how when you're listening to your unconscious, it will come out in the story that you're writing from the language of the night. And so it will speak to
Yes.
other people's unconsciousness, right? And how they view things. So this is a really significant moment for Tristan and Isolde. I mean, Ynez and Kieran, in that they are both transforming because of this union, this alchemical union in the darkness that is going to transform their souls and what their view of reality actually is. Because nothing is more powerful than seeing yourself in another person and seeing yourself desired by that other person and seeing yourself reflected in that other person's eyes. And that allows you
Mm.
to transform yourself. Back to the Emperor on the precipice of jumping off a cliff. He looks depressed as hell.
Mark Strong just gives the best performance in this moment where you can just see everything on his face that he's
Yeah.
feeling.
I love
It's
him so
it's
much.
it's amazing.
I have like a
And
secret
then
crush
his
on him.
reaction.
Mark, don't listen to
Oh.
this. I've loved him since Emma, the BBC version, in like I think it was the 90s. He's Mr. Knightley in that. Interesting role for him. But yeah, I love
Oh
him.
my gosh,
I love him so much.
he's such a great actor, and I love that he's getting to play this kind of character with the nuances and the vulnerability. It's just so good.
But I think he's gonna
And
turn. We're gonna see.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think so because it's still Mark Strong, but the reaction that he has when he notices the Desmond's there is also really interesting. It's like this moment of and like almost like hope in a way, in just the sense of like I think he recognizes something in Desmond.
That he wishes he
Um,
had. And Desmond says fear can be debilitating in so many ways. This is like a subtle way to call him a puppet. Eh, eh, There's all these excuses about this, and he's like calling out like what the sisters are hiding from him, disregarding,
mm,
the machines and the insurgency. Like they should have told you all about this stuff. Don't they have
yeah.
people everywhere? Um,
Mm,
Obviously they don't work for you, right?
mm,
And he goes into like this very spiritual conversation. It's very religious. It's like, do you believe in forces that extend beyond man and machine? And of course, this is from the sense of this story is this idea of gods or God or the
mm.
collective unconscious in a way, which is what the Bene Gesserit plug into to kind of see their visions and to see
Yeah.
beyond. Talks about his story and how like he was supposed to have died, but the gods listened to him that he would not fear, and he experienced a death and a rebirth. And
Yeah, this entire moment, all I could think about was the litany against fear that the Bene Gesserit talk about.
yeah,
Fear is
fear,
the mind killer,
killer,
and
fear is the little death. I think he has been given a legitimate power, even if it's
oh,
technological or
mm,
nanotechnology or something like that, right? So he has
ooh,
some sort of
okay,
power. He has an ability. And this is the trial by which the sisterhood have to go through. And eventually they end up
mm,
taking the seed of the lessons that he teaches them through that fear, and it turns into the box test. It's not real, but they use it on
okay,
all future Bene Gesserit because everybody has to go through
interesting.
this to establish themselves as
Mhm.
not having fear and to being a truth human. I literally do think that
Yes,
that could be like the trial, and it's very like they're witches and he burns them. Like it's very,
yeah,
burning of the dark feminine, that consumption. I fear it, thus I get rid of it. Oh man.
mm,
And his secret wish, good old Emperor Carino, he's like, if the gods could free me from the vice of a wedding, from this vice of a wedding, consider me a true believer. It's
the
all the
monarchy,
time, right? So we have anti-feminine power. That's the story that we are getting, which is consumptive power, right? Without creation, you only have
and
destruction.
I want to hear your take on this, but do you think Havoko knows what he's asking when he says that to Desmond?
No,
because he doesn't believe in himself enough to think that he could actually say, hey, I want you to do a political assassination for me.
What
He doesn't
decisions
have
does this man make for himself? He can't lead out of a white
No.
paper bag. He is literally a puppet. He is a puppet. He likes
Yeah.
having Kesh's hand up his ass.
He has no clue what he's just done, and the ripple effect that this one statement has is so wow.
It's gonna be so good.
And it's so interesting.
It's so
wow.
excited for next week's episode. Like, I'm just, oh my God, I'm so excited. And so, like, this happens. They have their, like, little, like, tete-a-tete in the weird rib cage, like, garden / looks like kind of being swallowed by the worm. Wild imagery that also the water flows from it. So that's like a femme symbol.
Yeah.
What is happening with this show? Like, it's so interesting.
like-
I don't even,
It made me
can't even
think of-
consume all of it. Like, it's like, I don't even know what to do. My brain is like, there's too much. I have to like segment out pieces. Like, that costume is really cool and that snake ring. But like, I gotta think about that like weird rib cage worm mouth with a waterfall.
Yeah.
Like, what is happening?
Part of me made me think of like the rib cage of like a beast of some kind, like a dragon that's been killed, and then the water is like it's blood flowing.
It also kind of looked like
like
maybe
a
a Venus like fly trap, like a little bit. Like, you know, like, I don't know. I need
Just
more.
so-
It's great. So Yaviko is like in his room, and then he goes and like he's like, I can't sleep. He's alone in his bed, and he leaves his room, and there is the most like vulva shaped roof
I
I've
was
ever
literally
seen.
saying,
What is happening? He lives from under feminine power, symbolically.
It reminded me of Wheel of Time in the island of the White Tower that's literally shaped like a vulva. And
He just like sleeps under feminine power. It's great. I mean,
yeah,
at least he knows his place. No, he doesn't. He's about to like, watch the footage on the Arrakis, and we see that footage, and we see Desmond swallowed by the worm. So he's entered into this transformational death rebirth. He's gone into the underworld. He will bring back an elixir of sorts to our emperor. But I just don't think he's in a positive change arc at all. So
no,
yeah,
and
he's not a good
curious
person to
because
take advice from.
in the footage that we see, there's at least 3 thumpers on the sand, and so I'm very curious because thumpers are used by the Fremen.
Yeah.
But then Desmond had told the Emperor that the Fremen weren't part of this thing that happened. It was an outside force. And so I'm wondering if there's like a
throwaway line from Tula, or was it Kesha that says like, I influence and keep the Emperor in line even as we undermine him on Arrakis.
Yeah, Kasha says that.
I wonder if there is more to the Bene Gesserit doing things on Arrakis than we see here, but we'll see. Well, they're tell you what it means when we get there.
But I do think it is interesting because the Ouroboros pins that they have on their dresses, it's a sandworm. So they already have some sort of connection to Arrakis in that way. So something's going on there that happened on Arrakis with Desmond for sure.
Pruitt is also not a kid who can sleep, and so he goes out into the hallway, and he has his little ball that was returned to him from Desmond, his salamander, and he speaks with him, and then Desmond shows up with his little light behind him and sits down on the floor, gets down to his level, and he's like, "You're a soldier. There's no wars here." Such a good lie. And Desmond like rebuffs that. And he's like, your sacrifice won't be in vain. And this is the House of Atreus motif, literally sacrificing the child to the vengeance that he has in mind for the sisterhood. And what's fascinating about salamanders, they are associated with fire because commonly they hang out in very wet wood. So when you put a piece of wet wood onto a fire, they launch themselves out of the wet wood because they don't want to be burned. But many people over time have gotten this idea that salamanders are actually fire. Like they are so associated with fire. Where does the toy go? It leaves before he starts burning.
Wait, really?
He looks for his toy.
I
He looks for his toy and it leaves before he starts burning.
I have it pulled up right now. I have to find this. Wait a second. Because I did not notice that the first time I watched it. The toy is not there.
The toy leaves because he was
Oh
about
my
to
gosh.
be on fire.
That's crazy.
What is this show? What is this show? It's so. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? And then we flash to Tasha, and she's like
Oh,
scratching off her skin because it's like starting to burn. She's bleeding, and then she sees Valya, and she's like, and she starts to burn, and Valya sees the burning truth, and then she says, "I see, mother, I see," and that's where we end the
and
episode.
it like she says that, and then we zoom into her eye where the sparks are reflected, and then we go into the eye,
Like,
and
it's
the
all
sparks
circular.
become the stars.
It's so good. And like, here's the thing. I don't know why Kesha exploded. I don't know why she burned, other than she's maybe too connected to the collective unconscious, and she's like picked up something, and this was her way of physically showing the prophecy and
Yeah.
what is ahead of them. And it was like she did it to herself because the Bene Gesserit are that powerful in
Interesting.
some ways. Because she's not bonded with this kid. She never actually met him. She left before he
No.
arrived. So, like, there's no way that
Yeah.
this was caused by him in any direct way, other than it was like uh Bene Gesserit weird psychosomatic experience.
Now that we've gone over the whole episode and we've kind of called out all of these different mythic motifs and themes, predominantly being consumption and how that factors into the show, I think it's also important to talk about the alchemical journey, which is another journey that's similar to the hero's journey, the heroine's journey, the wild woman that Clarissa Piccola Estes talks about. It's a personal inner journey that you go on. And Jung talks about this a lot and how that fits in psychologically for your own inner journey and work and what you're going through. And so it's typically separated into 4 primary phases. And the first phase is called nigredo, or the blackening. And its initial stage within this phase is calcination. And this is characterized by fire and smoke. It's the death phase. It's psychologically when the old way must be burnt away in order to start this process towards rebirth. So, throughout the episode, we're seeing things on fire, we're seeing smoke, and we're seeing the burning truth. And this idea that Valya has around the mission that the Bene Gesserit have, that literally goes up in flames. And only then is she able to start having some clarity. And so we end this episode kind of ready to move into disillusion, which is characterized by water when you start washing away the ash and the burnt up dead pieces. And that's when we start transitioning into the next phase. So I'll be definitely looking for, because we have a lot of water symbolism for sure within this episode, but I'm going to be looking for that going forward for sure, as we'll see where we progress throughout this alchemical journey. And so we leave the episode off having achieved calcination. Any thoughts, NC?
I think it'll be really interesting to see it like overall. I do definitely see that this is something that's happening. And so I want to see more, because I find that like sometimes you have to be like more towards the end of the story to kind of trace the arc of what is happening, especially when you have like an ensemble cast like this. So,
Yeah.
thinking about like the lenses by which we have to look at the show, all of the characters are playing in our subconscious, but it's specifically from a few key POVs, right? So Valya, Ynez, and Emperor, and of course Desmond. So it's interesting that's kind of like 2 guys and 2 girls.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And actually, one thing I think we forgot to touch on just briefly is Desmond's scar,
Right.
the wound that he gets after the whole debacle on Arrakis, and his eye is also slightly affected, and the scar goes like all the way down his eye. And the word scar is derived from the Greek word askara, meaning place of fire. And the fire is found within the scar, and the scar is already present in the fire. And so what's so interesting about that is that side of his face, he's like pressing on his temple on that side whilst Pruitt is burning up. And so
Mhm.
I don't know if there's some direct correlation there, but symbolically, he
Has
has
the
this
fire.
flame of consumption within him.
Yeah, and he has this power, which is ties to what I've been saying with the idea that he has this power. I don't know. Again, I don't
Mm,
know if it's like I don't know if it's mystical, like sort of what
mm,
Bene Gesserit can do with their visions and things like that. I don't know if that's what it is, or if it's
mm.
more technological and it's just something that like he has created. I don't think it matters because symbolically it's the same.
Yeah,
Yeah, but either way, I'm super looking forward to exploring him as a character. He's great.
yeah. Oh my gosh.
We have talked for a very long time. This was a great first episode. Apologies in advance. They will be long like this because there's so much to dig into.
Yes.
I this episode and how we talk about the symbolism, the mythological motifs, the themes, all of the different things that we saw within this episode really inspires you, please feel free to leave a comment or ask us a question. We'll include some of these in our next show. We're looking forward to having you come along on this journey with us. Hannah and I are having a blast with it and occasionally get to fangirl out in amazing ways about the things that are happening. So we want to make sure that you're coming along with us for the journey. Make sure to subscribe to Dune Newsnet so that you can catch up with all of these episodes, as well as follow us on socials. Podcast above all is our socials everywhere. I am Marie Claire Gould, and my socials are Marie C. Gould, where you can find them. And Hannah.
Yeah, you can find me on social media at Shihai Spring on Instagram, Twitter, Blue Sky. Thank you so much for joining me, MC. I'm so excited that we get to go on this journey. And yeah, it's awesome. And thank you, all of you novices, for joining us.
And Hannah, sisterhood above all.
Sisterhood above all.
We hope you've enjoyed your visit to the Sisterhood. Remember to like and subscribe so you know when the next episode drops. Stay tuned to DuneNewsNet.com and follow us at Podcast Above All on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky.